Okay, all right. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about soil fertility, a subject that I know nothing about. So if you think I'm going to solve the problem of how to fertilize with high-priced fertilizer, that isn't going to happen today. You got to get somebody smarter than me to do that. There's a handout coming around that we'll use just a little bit. But first I want to talk with you sort of about nutrients in plants. There's basically 16 essential nutrients. Actually, some now say 17, some say 18. Basically, on that first little chart, you'll see down at the bottom I've added nickel and cobalt. Some people say they're just beneficial but not essential to the plant. Basically, if they're considered essential to the plant, that means if that nutrient's not there, that plant won't survive. And so there are 16 nutrients that are basically essential in that plant. Now, if you look at that first chart, the first three things on there, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the plant gets that from the air and the soil. You don't add that. They use CO2 for the carbon. They can use the oxygen off of CO2. Water is H2O, so they get hydrogen and oxygen from the water also. So that's not something that you necessarily add out there. And those three nutrients or minerals right there comprise about 95% of the dry matter in a plant. All the other 13 to 15 really only comprise of less than 5 or 6% of the plant and things. So most of the structure of that plant is either carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen and things. But I list over there on the right side sort of a activity, and I can tell you that's not all the activity of all those nutrients, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of them, but I just wanted to kind of make a point that most of these are involved in enzyme activity, and that's why the plant can't survive without them. If they don't have certain enzymes, it doesn't carry on functions that it's got to have to grow and that sort of thing. So that's where most of these nutrients are used, especially the micronutrients. And I guess basically you consider nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are considered macronutrients. Nitrogen and potassium are the only two in that group that's required over 1% of the dry matter in there. Phosphorus is considered a macro, but actually in a dry matter sense, it's a little less in the plant than calcium is. And calcium, magnesium, and sulfur are considered secondary, and then all the rest of them are called micronutrients. And it has to do with how much is in the plant. Like I think down at towards the bottom, there's one called molybdenum. I mean, basically, that you just need like 1 part per 100,000 of molybdenum to meet the needs of that plant. So it needs very little of it, but it is essential that it be there, and it's going to be in the soil pretty much thing. And most of you, or a lot of you, if you fool with soybeans way back when soybeans got popular, I'm not taking questions, Cliff. All right, what you got? Oh, by the way, if you got a question, just blurt it out or raise your hand, or I'll ignore you and we'll go right on. What you got, Cliff?
When you talk about these micronutrients, do we have a history of having these micronutrient deficiencies in this mason-reed soil?
Not typically that we've seen the micronutrients. Now they are seeing...
Let me go ahead and clarify this question. Can we cause these problems by using water that has a large amount of iron in it? like you call it, copper deficiency?
I told you to start with that I don't know much about this subject. There are some substitutions. Now, you'd have to get somebody better in soil fertility than I am to say, but I don't think you're going to cause a major problem that way. But yes, if you over-fertilize with certain nutrients, they affect uptake of other nutrients. So high levels of one can impact another one. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get more specific, but not in the micronutrients. So yes, they are seeing some zinc deficiencies in some of the row crops that folks are talking about, and a lot of the row crop producers now are actually applying zinc in their fertilizer early on. If you have an alkaline soil, which is not typical in this area, where I grew up, our normal pH was about 7.4. We would often see an iron deficiency in the plant when it turned dry and it was young. Now, once you started getting rainfall, they picked that iron right back up and things. But anyway, talking about the three that you're really going to fool with in fertilizer is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You can at times see some deficiencies in these others, but they're not ones that you're going to normally see in plants and things like that. Now, the other two columns in that table are talking about mobility, and one of them is if that nutrient is mobile in the soil. And if it's mobile in the soil, what it kind of means is that it moves with water. If it's not mobile, it's probably well attached to the soil particle and things, so you're not going to have to worry about it moving with water and things like that. So basically, nitrogen, if it's in the nitrate form, which is, okay, and not on that table, but plants only take up these nutrients in certain forms. They don't take nitrogen as nitrogen. They either take it up as nitrate or ammonium. So for that to be available to the plant, it's got to be in one of those forms in the soil and things. But there are microorganisms in the soil that convert most of the nitrogen there into those forms. I talked last year I guess we did this virtually, but I was talking about fertilizers. And unfortunately, we don't really have access to ammonium nitrate anymore. I never knew it was explosive till it all happened out in Oklahoma City, and then so that's kind of a whole lot of regulations have come on that, and most companies have just decided they're not going to deal with it with all the paperwork required. Because that was a really good nitrogen fertilizer, because when you put it out there, it was in the form that the plant could take it up. Now we use a lot of urea, and urea it's a nitrogen source, but it is not in a form that the plant can absorb it. It has to go through a change in the soil, and there are microorganisms and enzymes that make that change pretty readily. But one of the problems with urea is one of the steps in that change is it goes through ammonia. And if you take the top off an ammonia bottle and realize that it's volatile, it's lighter than air, because you can smell it. You don't have to hold it up, you just smell it. So when it goes through that process, and if it happens right at the soil surface, you're going to have part of that volatilize into the air. Because basically some microorganisms take urea, they convert it to ammonia. Other microorganisms take that ammonia and convert it to ammonium. And then there's another set of microorganisms in the soil that take ammonium and convert it to nitrate. So typically, nitrate is the way the plant takes it up. That's the way it's in the soil most of the time. Now with urea fertilizer, and I wasn't going to get much into fertilizer, but they have things now that you can put on there. The urease inhibitor, and urease is the enzyme that breaks it down to ammonia. And so you can put this on there. What you're trying to do is buy yourself some time, because if all those reactions take place underground, you don't lose that ammonia, because those microorganisms, as soon as it's converted, they're going to pick it up to convert it to ammonium. So when you put that urease inhibitor, you're trying to buy yourself a few days, in basically 7 to 10 days, to get a rain to get that in the soil. And once you have a rain, you're not going to lose much of that nitrogen. So if you're using urea, which is pretty much what everybody's using, it is a really good idea to put it out right before a rain, because you want it to get in the soil so that all those reactions take place underground, and it's not exposed to the air to volatilize and things. So, and there are other things now that they've got. They've got these slow release nitrogens that are encapsulated in a polymer, and that polymer breaks down slowly over time, so it's released in a time sequence and things, so that all of it's not there at once and that sort of thing. So the different ways they're sort of coming up with to do that. And some people are using those. There's one called, there's Super U. Super U, I think, combines both the urease inhibitor and the poly coating. There's one, Environmental Smart Nitrogen, or ESN. That's just got the polymer coating and things. And it just breaks down. It's a longer term thing. You don't get all the nitrogen at once. It kind of spreads it out. Most of, or a couple of studies with these longer term that are polymer coated, is you probably don't want that to be your only nitrogen fertilizer. You probably want to blend it with another one that you get sort of a quick release of nitrogen, and then that other one, the other part, carries it longer through there. And that was a whole lot more than I was going to get into fertilizer. Talk a little bit about some other, the other column there is about mobility in the plant. And that means if the plant can take that nutrient and move it from one part of the plant to the other. Some of them are mobile in the plant, some of them are not. And that has a lot to do with, if you're looking for deficiency symptoms, if it is not mobile in the plant, deficiency symptoms are typically going to show up on the new leaves that are coming out. If that nutrient is mobile in the plant, deficiency symptoms are typically going to show up in the older leaves, or the older part of the plant, because they're going to take it out of the older part and put it in the newer part. So the mobility in the plant is kind of how you people will look at, if you've got a deficiency, what part of the plant you want to look at to see if you're deficient in that nutrient and things. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit about some of the nutrients that you can add as a fertilizer. First, talk some about sulfur. Sulfur used to be no problem whatsoever. You know, they used to talk about acid rain. Well, acid rain was because of sulfur in the air and rainfall coming down, and it added sulfur to the soil. So we never saw a sulfur deficiency much at all, because every rainfall was adding sulfur down there. Now with EPA guidelines, and they've got to scrub the air or the exhaust coming off of these manufacturing plants, what they're doing is taking the sulfur out of that exhaust. So we don't have as much in the air, so we don't get the natural fertilization. But they also have reduced acid rain and that sort of thing. So there's good and bad points to that. So now typically, or not typically, but occasionally we're going to see some sulfur deficiencies. Sulfur is a part of only 2 enzymes in the plant. And those 2 enzymes are necessary for plant growth and survival. They're also involved in photosynthesis, those 2 enzymes. So if you're deficient in sulfur, you can put out nitrogen fertilizer and not get a greening effect on the plant, because there's not enough sulfur there for the 2 enzymes that it's needed for that plant to grow and things. So if you're looking at sulfur deficiency, kind of follow your nitrogen, and if you're not getting a real response to that nitrogen, then possibly it's sulfur. Typically, sulfur deficiencies, if you got it, are going to show up on a sandy type soil. They're going to first appear in most cool season grasses, especially wheat will show. I know the soil fertility guy once told me, if you want to see if you got a sulfur deficiency, just get you a little bag of gypsum. You can buy it at Walmart in a little 5-pound bag and mark you off an area about 20 by 20 and put that gypsum out there, because gypsum is calcium sulfate. And if that wheat changes color in that little square, then you probably need some sulfur. But sulfur is tied a whole lot to organic matter. So typically when we get into the summer and microorganisms are real active in the soil and breaking down organic matter, there's usually enough sulfur out there. So it's rare to see it in the summer, but cool season crops can show that just because of microbial activity and things. The calcium that's there is used. It's got a lot to do with cells in the plant and the integrity of those cells, so that you have healthy cells as they're growing and things like that. If the cell wall or the cell membrane breaks down, then that plant's going to stop growing, and that's what calcium kind of does. The way you add calcium typically is with a lime and things, and your soil's going to have a good bit of calcium. You get a soil test report back, and basically it tells you, which you get several minerals as parts per million. Just generally thinking about it, an acre, what they call an acre furrow slice, that's an acre of soil that's 6 inches deep, is thought to weigh about 2 million pounds. So when you see a soil test report or something that says parts per million, all you got to do is multiply it by 2, and that's how many pounds per acre you've got out there, an estimate of the pounds per acre, because the soil itself weighs 2 million pounds in an acre in things. So calcium, we got a pretty good bit. Most, even if you're low, I think they consider about 700 or something as low, but that's 1,400 pounds out there and things. But the plant does use a pretty good bit of that. So calcium is important for cell walls and things. And then phosphorus, and we talked about sulfur, but phosphorus is important in the energy part of the plant. But phosphorus is important to us for energy, because you probably heard of ADP and ATP, and that's how we get energy. Is we take a phosphate bond, we break a phosphate bond, and it releases energy. That's the way our bodies get energy. That's the way a plant gets energy. And that is adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate. So you're just going back and forth in things. So phosphorus is real important. And phosphorus has a lot to do with new growth, because it has energy. So it does help your plants with rooting. So if you're low in phosphorus, you're probably not going to have as vigorous a root growth as you do if you're adequate in phosphorus and things. And then potassium, that's another one of the macronutrients, and it's the only, that and nitrogen, the only one that's over 1% in the plant. Potassium is real important in water control in the plant, water and nutrient movement up and down, because it controls the opening and closing of what they call stomates, which is how water gets out of the plant from the roots and things. And if they close it off, you don't get much movement. That's what happens in dry weather when you get droughts and plants start wilting, is because they're not moving water through there. And potassium is what's regulating that opening and closing of little pores in the leaf and things. But if you're in with Bermuda grass, potassium is also a very important component there, because it does give you it kind of reduces the incidence of disease. Now the theory here is if you got adequate phosphorus, you get a thicker cuticle on the leaf, which is a waxy substance on the leaf. And so you don't get as much infection from microorganisms and things. So in our, basically the hybrid Bermuda grasses are typically susceptible to disease in the southeast, and even common Bermuda grass and things. And usually when you start seeing disease symptoms on that in a pasture or something, you're probably low in potassium. And so that potassium level will help kind of regulate that. But again, it's also, and also it's important, potassium is important for rhizome and stolon development. And those are, when you see Bermuda grass and it's running out of, you see those little stems right on the ground running, that's a stolon. And Bermuda grass also has the same thing underground. Basically, they did a study years ago, and if you got too low in potassium, you wouldn't even have a rhizome come out of Bermuda grass. That plant would sit there, but it's not going to go. So having that potassium level, and this is one of the things that is typically associated with what they call Bermuda grass decline. When you say, my Bermuda grass is not growing like it used to grow, then you probably need to look at your potassium level in the soil. Because what's probably happening is that plant's not spreading out. It's just maintaining that little clump there. So potassium is real important to that plant, especially Bermuda grass, in spreading and moving and disease resistance. And probably in other plants also, we deal with potassium. And then nitrogen. And nitrogen's that's what plants grow on. And that nitrogen's almost 2% of the plant. So as far as the nutrient fertilizer, this is the one that's going to be used probably the most. And that's important in all kinds of proteins, enzymes, all the growth of the plant is with nitrogen. So if you want to spur growth, nitrogen's the thing to do it out there. And however you get it in the soil that's a benefit to you. Now talk a little bit about just fertilization in general. The first thing I advise you to do is soil sample. If you don't know what the level is and you just apply fertilizer, you don't know if you're helping a situation or you're not. You're probably not going to put enough out there to be detrimental, but you don't need to spend the money if you don't need that nutrient and things. So if you get a soil test or a soil sample, it helps you recognize, okay, what do I need in the soil for plant growth? So I certainly encourage a soil test at some point. Now a lot of people do them about every 3 years or something like that. But I also tell you or suggest that once you get a soil test, don't throw that in the trash. It's like, oh, okay, I fertilized by this soil test, I'm going to throw it away. Because if you have a history of soil tests, you can kind of monitor what your management's doing to the level of each of those nutrients out there. If I can take a soil test now and I can look back a couple of years ago and my phosphorus is going down, it tells me that what I'm doing with phosphorus is not maintaining the level. So I need to do something a little different in fertilization. So if things are falling, you might want to think about adjusting. So having a history of soil test is a benefit to you just to see. Because any soil test, they've got a yield in mind when they tell you those recommendations. I don't remember exactly what the yield is in the testing lab at LSU and things, but if you're not trying to produce at that level, then you may not be using the nutrients at that level. So it may say apply this, but if you're getting what you're doing and you're maintaining that level, you don't necessarily need to follow exactly what's in that recommendation and things there. And but so that history's pretty good there. Now, another thing with soil testing is it gives you some values. They say out there very low, low, medium, high, and very high. I think most soil tests do that. Years like this with, let's see, nitrogen, I guess urea, I think somebody told me the other day was $5.35 a ton. I think potash, potash or DAP or phosphate fertilizers over $700 a ton. I mean, you really got to think about what your fertilization program is going to be this year. If you look at those values and medium basically means that you're pretty close to the level that you need to be in a soil. So on years when fertilizer prices are high, if I'm in that medium, I might want to kind of cut back on that nutrient a little bit. If it's rated high, that means you've got 100%, somewhere between 100 and 125% of that nutrient that you need of that nutrient in the soil. So definitely years when fertilizer prices are way up, if I'm rated high, I'm probably not going to be looking to apply much of that nutrient. And then you can get very high, and that's above 125% of that nutrient, which I don't think they'd recommend any in a very high range and things. So, so you can also use that in these type years. You can use that soil test to make decisions as to where I'm going to go. Now, remember, if you put off fertilization this year, you're probably going to have to pick it up next year, so you don't want to just eliminate and say, okay, I'm not adding anything, because then you're going to be doubling up the next time and things. So it's kind of hard to make that decision, but that's what those little very low, medium, and that sort of thing. Medium means you're within about 75 to 100%. If you're on the upper level of medium, you're probably right out there at the required amount of that nutrient there. Now, in cow-calf or in cattle production, there's two scenarios here that you're dealing with. You're dealing with hay production and you're dealing with a pasture. And those are two very different things. In hay production, you're taking nutrients off. I mean, all that grass that you're producing and putting in a bale and you're moving it somewhere, you took it from that spot. And all those nutrients went with it. So fertilizing a hay field or considering fertilizing, you're probably going to need to emphasize more in the hay area than the pasture area. About every ton, you're probably going to remove 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen and potash out of there. You're going to remove about 5 to 10 pounds of phosphorus off of that thing for every ton of hay you take off of there. So that takes it from an area to move it. But that means that there are nutrients in that bale, and you're going to feed it. Now, cattle or livestock generally excrete about 80 to 90% of the nutrients they take in. So you're going to be putting most of those nutrients somewhere else. So you can try to use that to your advantage. On the backside of that thing, and I'll explain that picture right quick. I guess I skipped over that. But there's what they call Liebig's law of the minimum with the little fence thing. And that's what's talking about these essential elements in there. Is if you look at that little low part, that's kind of representing the limiting factor of the limiting nutrient that's limiting yield. And it doesn't matter how tall you build the rest of the fence, you're not going to be able to put any livestock in there that's too big that'll get over that thing. That's the same thing with nutrients. If you're missing sulfur, you can add twice as much nitrogen and you're not going to get a response of twice as much because you're missing. So whichever one is the minimum, that's the one that sets your yield potential. And that's what the little fence things that kind of describing there. But anyway, if you look over at the other, and I'm going to have to look at these because I don't even remember what order I got the tables in. But this is just using an example, and this is from a hay sample. The first one is, and this is what I was talking about, that animals don't use a lot of those minerals. The first table there shows you the amount of nutrients that are removed when you sell livestock off your place. Now, a grazing dairy is a little different than cow, calf, and stocker. Obviously, because a grazing dairy is taking milk. So they're taking the milk and they're sending it off site. So that's why they've got a lot of nutrients that they take off for their product. But also you remember in a dairy, they're bringing in a lot of nutrients because they're bringing in feed. When those cows are in the barn, they're usually giving them feed. Well, that's bringing nutrients to your site that can be distributed out on there. And basically, if you've got a mature cow that's dry, you kind of consider that she's not going to use it. I mean, all she's doing is maintaining herself. And so all she's just going to replace the nutrients that she's excreting out. So it's kind of a zero balance there with a dry cow. But now cow, calf, and stocker, but you're only removing about 10 pounds of nitrogen, 3 pounds of phosphorus, and less than a pound of potash when that animal leaves your farm. So we're adding a lot of nutrients, but we're not taking a lot away from the farm. So the thing that we need to start thinking about, especially when prices are like they are for fertilizers now, is
Per head?
Huh? Yeah.
Per head.
So where are all the nutrients? I'm leaving a lot here, so I need to devise some kind of plan that these nutrients end up out in my pasture somewhere. And there's a lot of them out there. If you look at the next table, that's looking at a 1,200 pound bale of hay that was 10.5% crude protein, had 0.18% phosphorus and 1.6% potassium. Now, hay, I'm assuming it's about 15% moisture, so I took these numbers, multiplied them by 1,700, whatever was 85% of the original weight of the bale there at 1,200 pounds. Now, the multiplier factor that's showing there, crude protein is 16% nitrogen. So I took all that crude protein, multiplied it by 0.16, and you've got 17.1 pounds of nitrogen in that 1,200 pound bale. Now, nitrogen, when it is excreted, manure, urine, it's in a form that can volatilize or can volatilize. So they kind of estimate that about 50% of that's going to be available to the soil. So that's what the little percent available. The phosphorus and potassium is just an estimate of, the cattle excreting about 85% of what they take in and things. So in that last column, that's the nutrient potential to the soil. So with that one bale, if it weighed 1,200 pounds, that's what you're adding back to the soil and things. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot. You're getting 8.6 pounds of nitrogen. But now think about how many bales you feed in a year. I mean, if you feed 100, you just put out, 860 pounds of nitrogen somewhere that those animals put on that place. So if you can manage where they put that, you got a pretty good thing. And I can tell you, like at mine, and I'm a little different than some others, I don't have shade in every pasture, because a lot of these nutrients end up in the shade areas, because those cattle go eat and then they go to the shade and lay down, and that's where they deposit all these nutrients. I have to let my cows to shade. So when I feed in the winter, I shut that off. They don't come out of the pasture. So all of that gets deposited in that pasture. Now, I don't have water in every one of them, so but that's kind of a way that I've looked at that, hey, I'm going to start using some, and I move pastures when I feed hay. I used to feed in one, it's like I feed, and that's my hay pasture right there, and I can tell you after about 5 or 6 years, I had some organic matter right there, but I only had it in that thing, and I thought, and I did one time take a manure spreader and scrape that up and spread it out on the field, but not many, and I don't have one. I had to borrow one of those. And I thought, well, heck, I hate borrowing this stuff, so why don't I just feed the cows? And I just move them around the pastures. I don't have a real mud problem, because I move every time I put a bale out, I move that rack. I don't feed them in the same place and that sort of thing. But that's just a thought of, I'm trying to capture these nutrients that the cows will apply for me and use them and try to cut what I'm having to do with fertilizer. And with that, I'm pretty much told more than I know. So, well, I just have about 40. All right.
Wait a minute, let me ask you a question. How many cows do you put around a rack?
Well, all right, and there are differences in feeding. We can talk about that too. I usually have about 40 cows, and I usually have 5 or 6 bales out a week. I put out hay on the weekend, and that lasts all week long and all. So I don't feed. Now, there are people, you and some others, that feed daily, and that's not a bad thing, necessarily to do and things. So, but if you only put out enough for a day's feeding, you need to have enough rack space that all the cows can get there. Because if you put out just a little, or this is going to last a day, the bigger cows are going to get the bigger part of that. And then when they're tired of eating, the little ones. So that's a point too, is if you're doing daily, some are unrolling hay every day and spreading that out, and that's a good thing. I mean, that really spreads nutrients out in that field, and they move across fields and things like that. So how you feed does have an impact also, and all. But any others? All right, I appreciate it.